I'm standing outside a restaurant that's believed to have invented my favorite Japanese dish, tonkatsu. Well, technically its predecessor, katsuretsu, which is a loan word from cutlet. This place opened in 1895 and has served people like Yasujiro Ozu, one of the best Japanese filmmakers ever, and Osamu Tezuka, the godfather of manga and anime. But what's most interesting about this place is that it's likely the very first restaurant to serve Japanese people a cuisine most don't know about. Yoshoku. Yoshoku literally means Western food, but unlike the name suggests, this is a category of Japanese food, made with Eastern ingredients and traditions. And it's mostly a cuisine that hides in plain sight. I actually mentioned yoshoku once before in my video on Napolitan spaghetti, a pasta dish Japan invented for American occupation troops after World War II. But this time I want to introduce the rest of this cuisine to you, because it's extremely fascinating for a country that's known to be homogenous and kinda culturally isolated. This restaurant behind me is a significant location for yoshoku, as it's said to have popularized some iconic dishes. But I think looking beyond here and into the larger history of why this cuisine within a cuisine even exists will paint a unique perspective on Japan and how food in general reflects a zeitgeist.
Modern Tokyo, capital of the Japanese Empire, for it has the unique distinction of having assimilated the exterior forms of a Western metropolis without having sacrificed its Oriental modes of thought and feeling.
As we dive into the history of yoshoku, I want to show you how prevalent it is across the country. Tokyo is filled with restaurants serving this cuisine, all of which have a pretty cool retro aesthetic. I'm in Ikebukuro right now, because there's one place I really want to go to. This is Takase, a bakery that started here in 1918, which is around the time Western dishes really started taking off in Japan. In the last century, Takase has become pretty successful, with numerous branches across Tokyo. One of these branches happens to be a yoshoku restaurant, up on the third floor of this building. This is a hamburg steaky, which is something I don't think most people associate with Japan, but it is a staple here. This was potentially first introduced to Japan in 1882 at the opening ceremony of the country's very first cooking school. At this school, French and German cooks were invited to train Japanese people to cook with Western standards and tools like stoves and pans. At the time, it was simply called a German steak and was served with tomato sauce. At some point, the tomato sauce was replaced with a Japanese demi-glace sauce, inspired by French cooking. Holy shit, that's so juicy. That is incredibly thick with two C's. Around the mid-1900s, hamburg steak finally became a popular dish in Japan, partially due to the fact that it could be made with cheap meat, but more importantly, it became popular because of the Japanese Imperial Army. And to understand why this dish was so popular in the Japanese army is actually a key to understanding why Western food became popular here in the first place. For a long time, Japan was sealed off from much of the world under a policy called Sakoku. Under this policy, foreign trade was strictly regulated and mostly limited to China, Korea, and the Dutch. And all of these countries were only really allowed to trade through Nagasaki. This was done for a lot of reasons that would take too long to get into, but a large reason was the shogun's worries that Western powers, especially Portugal, would eventually invade and colonize Japan. The shogun saw Europeans increasingly take control of lands across Asia and the New World, particularly through the spread of religion. And when Japanese Christians attempted a rebellion in Nagasaki, the Portuguese were expelled and trade with the West was limited to the Dutch, who promised to perform trade without religious influence. For over 250 years, this isolation from foreign influence allowed Japan to flourish with its many unique traditions into the modern era, and maintain its independence. Now, there's a reason why I'm talking about all of this in a food video, and that's because at this time, Japan was a largely pescatarian country, meaning that the diet here was mostly made up of vegetables, rice, and fish. Red meat was banned for centuries in Japan, mostly because of religious and environmental reasons, and I promise that plays a role into why yoshoku became such a big deal here. Across these years, many ships from the West attempted to make contact with Japan, with varying successes. With each arrival, the Japanese started to notice an increasing gap between their technology and the outside world. And in 1853, US Commodore Matthew Perry showed up in Tokyo Bay with 4 steam-powered warships. Japan had just found out it largely missed out on the Industrial Revolution. Their military would stand no chance against the US Navy, so the shogun was forced to open trade with the United States. Afterwards, Japan was pressured to sign even more treaties with other Western empires, which became known as the Unequal Treaties. With these treaties, Japan lost control over its tariffs and even some of its territory. This was humiliating for the country to say the least, and the shogun took most of the blame for it. The emperor at the time would take over from the shogun and began what's known as the Meiji Restoration. Emperor Meiji saw that cutting off the West wasn't going to stop them from eventually colonizing Japan. Instead, he believed that to maintain Japan's independence, the best thing to do was to be like the Western powers, to adopt their way of doing things, and become as militarily powerful. Meiji changed pretty much every institution in Japan to mirror that of the West, from establishing modern banking, a national education system, building railways across the country, and replacing samurai with a modern Western-style army. They even destroyed over 2,000 castles because they represented feudal Japan, which honestly kinda sucks for historical preservation. And just to be clear, this all happened within like 40 years. Japan went from being an isolated feudal country to one of the major powers of the world in like 4 decades. Like, they fought a war with Russia and won. During this rapid change, Meiji also lifted the ban on red meat. He believed that one of the reasons why Westerners looked bigger and stronger than the Japanese was partially due to their diet, which is heavy with meat. As the Meiji Restoration progressed, more and more Japanese people were encouraged to eat meat and Western food in order to become as strong as a Westerner. Something like nikujaga, which is a huge dish in Japan, didn't exist until this era. This dish, which has a lot of that umami flavor and vibrant colors from washoku, was actually one of the first yoshoku dishes developed for the Japanese imperial military. Apparently, the Japanese Navy wanted to feed their soldiers something similar to the beef stew that the British Navy ate. So yoshoku was inadvertently developed during the Meiji era, and a lot of people at the time didn't really see this as real Japanese food. So they created a new term for traditional Japanese food instead: washoku. Washoku is a Japanese cuisine that encompasses some of Japan's most beautiful and respected dishes. Stuff like sushi, soba, and shabu shabu are washoku, as they're viewed as elegant and centuries-old traditions. But yoshoku, on the other hand, is now more so seen as like Japanese soul food. So the Meiji Restoration is really what gave birth to yoshoku, and much of the reasoning behind its development was Japan's drive to become one of the powerful Western countries that kept showing up onto its shores. This drive turned Japan into an empire itself, which, let's say, didn't end well. But yoshoku was here to stay, and has now become a very integral part of Japan. This cuisine is actually the result of a much larger history between Japan and the West. And the existence of this cuisine is an example to why Japan is one of the most powerful countries in the world now. This is curry rice, which actually happens to be the national dish of Japan. I've never seen it plated like this, where the curry is separated from the rice. And I'm assuming what you're meant to do is to pour it. It's very messy. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. That's very smoky. For the most part, curry rice is influenced by Indian cuisine, but India obviously isn't a Western country. This dish is mainly part of yoshoku because Indian curry powder was introduced to Japan through British colonists. To the Japanese, British India was associated with the West, and now Japan's national dish happens to be yoshoku. This place looks like a fish market on the surface, but it's actually a bakery. This hayashi rice has a hint of tomato in the sauce, and the beef has been stewed for a really long time, so it kind of just breaks apart and melts in your mouth. This next one is a pretty interesting addition. This is toroko rice. It's a specialty dish from Nagasaki, and it's basically a mix of other yoshoku dishes in one. Tonkatsu, pilaf, and Napolitan. Nobody for sure knows where toroko rice gets its name from, because it means Turkish rice. But it's definitely not from Turkey, since this is a pork dish, and, well, most Turkish people don't eat pork. There's a lot of theories as to why this dish has its name. Some think that the pilaf part might come from Turkey, but nobody knows for sure. Now, most of these dishes have pretty uncertain origins. Despite a few exceptions, the inspiration for a lot of yoshoku dishes aren't directly tied to one specific country. Instead, they're often just a general idea of what people here thought Western food looked and tasted like. Now, being from a Western country, I don't think a lot of yoshoku is anything like food in the West. But that's not really the point. This isn't meant to be authentic food from Europe or America. This is Japanese food. This is something called a doria, which actually doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It's basically a Japanese casserole with baked rice and white cream on top with some sort of meat. You might have noticed that there's a lot of yoshoku dishes, so this isn't some sort of limited phenomenon. This is now part of Japanese culture and a huge part of its cuisine. The list goes on, and if it weren't for the sake of repetition, we could be going around Tokyo for way longer. This restaurant opened in 1895, right in the middle of the Meiji Restoration, and it's possibly the birthplace of some iconic Japanese dishes. The breaded crumb surrounding the katsuretsu is so nice. It's so good. That's super interesting if this is the first original omurice, because I feel like they've cooked the rice with some sort of alcohol. I think this place and this cuisine is a good representation of the paradox of this country. Japan always feels like it's contradicting itself. The country is known for being super futuristic, but it's also super traditional. The people here are really polite, but also really lonely. The country is known for keeping out influence and people from the outside world, but is also surprisingly diverse and adapting. I think yoshoku is a pretty good example of how this country is actually open to changing its culture and taking in foreign ideas. Of course, in their own way. What it means to be Japanese or American or whatever identity is more malleable than most of us think. I feel like a lot of people try to put borders around food, but it's never that simple. I mean, curry is just as Japanese as matcha now, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think that's what makes culture way more interesting and varied. And we have to remember that our country's cuisines aren't just a product of who we are, but also those that are around us.